Welcome back to Court TV Live. I'm Judge Ashley Wilcott. Thank you for joining us this afternoon. Joining me now, I have a very special guest, former attorney for Justin Ross Harris, Carlos Rodriguez. Thank you for joining us. We've been talking about this case, the fact that the Georgia Supreme Court overturned his conviction, and that's the conviction for the murder of his 22-month-old son, Cooper. The jury convicted him of that murder, and now the Georgia Supreme Court has overturned that. Let me start with that and then move backwards to your prior representation of Mr. Harris. And I'd love to get your thoughts on the Supreme Court's decision, specifically some of the things they decided, and that there was evidence that should have been excluded from the charge of murder, that the jury should not have heard evidence about extramarital sexual relationships and what kind of man he was, because they found that was really needlessly cumulative and prejudicial. What are your thoughts about that decision?
Well, it's not surprising. And first of all, Ashley, it's good to be with you. Today is no surprise. Quite frankly, the Georgia Supreme Court's majority opinion in many ways mirrors the very arguments that we have been making for the past 8 years. It's the same arguments that we made to the trial court. It's the same arguments that we made to the jury. It's the same arguments that we made to the Georgia Supreme Court. It just so happens that finally someone listened. The trial court, if only she had listened and followed the law, then we wouldn't have had all of this time, and Ross wouldn't have had all of this time needlessly waiting for justice in prison.
So let's talk about the fact this trial was in 2016. I understand that you and two other attorneys did file a motion for new trial. To your point, to the judge directly, Judge Mary Staley Clark is the one, and you really have said and argued that she prevented you from challenging the police and expert witnesses. Tell us a little bit about how she prevented that.
Sure. So if you can recall, back in 2014, in June of 2014, it was actually 8 years ago on Saturday. Cooper died tragically in a hot car. He was forgotten to be in the car when Ross went to work that day. Unfortunately, these tragedies do happen, and they happen often throughout the country. And so there was this swell of public attention as to why this man was charged with felony murder for forgetting his son in the car. And so in an attempt to justify their jump to conclusions, the police inserted many false and misleading statements to a magistrate in applying for search warrants and in applying for arrest warrants. One of them being that Ross admitted to researching hot car deaths and researching on the internet how long it would take for a child to die in a hot car. Now, obviously, that is a pretty damning piece of evidence if it had in fact occurred. But what we wanted to show the jury is that the state's theory was built on a house of cards. One being this cockamamie theory of motive, but the other were lies justified to justify this jumping to conclusions. And so when the trial court prevented us from cross-examining the police officers that had applied for these search warrants and made sworn statements under oath that were patently false and that were admitted to being false, that is an unfair fight, okay? And what the Supreme Court identified was that the trial court's repeated abuses of discretion, okay, it put the defense in a position where we are unfairly defending a man's innocence. And that should never happen. It doesn't matter whether someone is of good character or bad character. That's not what a jury's determination is supposed to turn on. It's supposed to be on the evidence. And so we were simultaneously handcuffed and preventing a cross-examination of these detectives, and at the same time having to defend with one arm behind our back all of this salacious evidence of sexual liaisons that should never have been before the jury because it had nothing to do with Cooper.
So do you think that it failed at the beginning of the case? Do you think that the case should have been separated from the beginning, that any of the sexual allegations against him for other crimes, other children, should have been heard separately from the one against him for the alleged murder, now reversed, of Cooper?
Again, the Georgia Supreme Court's decision that the counts 6, 7, and 8 should have been severed from the counts related to Cooper. That wasn't simply something that we alleged in our motion for new trial. This is what we have been arguing since before the trial even started.
So let me circle back on something that you said, Carlos, and you're right. I can attest to the fact that regrettably there are hot car deaths more often than we should ever see, and they do happen nationwide, worldwide. But does this mean that you think that no one should ever be charged with murder when there is a death of a child who's been left in a hot car and dies?
I'm sorry, so I was having technical difficulties. If you can just repeat that question for me, I apologize.
Absolutely, that's okay. You had commented on the fact that your client had been charged with felony murder for a child left in a car, and lots of other cases you don't see individuals charged. Does that mean that you're saying no one should ever be charged with a crime, with felony murder or murder, for leaving a child in a hot car and that child then passes away?
No, what I'm saying is that in this case, the police jumped to conclusions, okay? And that should never happen. So police ought to investigate honestly, seeking the truth. And the reality is that what happened on June the 18th, 2014, is exactly what Ross told the detectives happened, that this was an accident. So I believe, yes, when a tragedy like this happens, okay, and a child is forgotten because of a memory failure, and it happens that a child tragically dies, that is not the result of criminal intent. And so, yes, that person should never be charged. I promise you, the punishment that has fallen upon Ross and Leanna and the family, and having to live without Cooper Harris, that is punishment enough. And any parent, and there are many that have had to suffer through this.
And Carlos,
I don't believe they ought to be prosecuted.
And I'm sorry to interrupt. I know we're almost out of time, but I have to ask you this, because you know the players in this case. Now that this has been reversed, do you think that there is going to be a new trial? Do you think the prosecution is going to want to go up against him again on murder charges?
I don't know. So that would be a question for the Cobb County District Attorney's Office. I'm certainly very encouraged, okay, that with time there may be an opportunity for the right result, and that's my hope.
All right, and zealous advocacy expected of all attorneys, criminal defense attorneys. You all have been advocating zealously for your client for a very long time. Carlos Rodriguez, thank you so much for joining us here on Court TV.